Hey, hello everyone. Welcome back to our Wednesday weekly live streams. Today will be a continuation of Next.js, um, the one that we saw last week, where we built a simple Next app with a GraphQL integration. And today we'll talk about how to do authentication with Next.js, and we'll see how token that is generated with a JWT server can be used with Hasura, and then we can try out some queries with permissions. And yeah, so for this, we'll be using NextAuth, which is like an open source library for Next.js. There's an authentication library. Let's get started with the docs for them. So they have like an example app that we can clone. I'm going to post this on chat. Maybe you'll just put it on, this is a GitHub link. So I'll just post this on chat. So this would be using the API routes on Next.js, if that is the question from 21. Yeah, so this won't be using auth 0. This will be using the custom JWT server. So we'll be creating a token, signing a token with a secret, and then we'll integrate that with our Hasura Cloud account, the project on that, and we'll see how the token generated on the client is authorized to access certain data. Right, so this is the GitHub repo that I'm going to clone. This is the official example app that they've given to get started with. So let's start with this one. Let me zoom in a little bit. And this would be next auth example. Right, and let me just look at the layout. So we have a few components, a pages directory, the typical one from Next.js, and we have an API directory with the auth functionality. So this would cover our next auth module. Let me do npm install, get started. So NextAuth has a bunch of providers. So if you go to their configuration, you can look at the built-in OAuth providers, which will have like the popular services. You can use all these sign-in services, which with the client ID and secret ID that's generated. And you also have a couple of other integrations. There's one with sign in with email, which can send like a magic link to your email, and then use that as a login method. And there is a custom sign in with credentials, which you can use to log in with username and password combination. This could be any kind of username. It could be email, or it could be like just a username. And you're expected to actually perform the logic of verifying the password and doing the logic of the login post this. This is just a boilerplate setup for you to implement this, but the token generation will happen on the JWT side. So, and the verification will also happen separately. So this is signed with credentials. Today we'll look at using some built-in provider. I was thinking to do GitHub integration and maybe also Google. So sign in with Google or sign in with GitHub, right? And yes, I will post the code to GitHub definitely once this app is done. Cool. So we have the modules ready. Let me open this up over code. Seems to be a cache issue. Let me turn this over Sublime. All right, I'm facing a couple of screen issues. Let me try VS Code again. Yes, again, let me close this. Yeah. Right, so let me zoom in a little bit. I guess this is pretty much visible. Right. Awesome. So for NextAuth, we have these packages, which is Next-Auth 3.2. So we'll actually change this to stable. This was released, I think, a couple of days back. So this went stable. And there are issues with the zero point 0.6 version of Next.js. So I'm reverting it to 0.5. And let me do an npm install again. The React versions are obviously the latest. SQLite 3 comes in by default, but we'll not make use of this. There's an option to use database integrations with NextAuth, which would be to create some user account and session details and store that in database. We'll see how that will be useful or when you would want to use that. This would actually involve like creating a Postgres schema. So with Hasura, you will have a Postgres DB, right? NextAuth has a schema which creates a bunch of tables like accounts, sessions, users, and so on with the predefined columns. Now, you will have to create these. This is basically a simple SQL command that you can copy paste on the SQL tab of the console, and then connect this when you're setting up the app on Next.js, right? So this will be useful if so this is mandatory if you're using email provider, which is sending you like a magic link to the email address. But this is optional for any other integration, especially if you're using JWT. You don't need to store the session information in the database, right? So this will be completely optional in that case. But when you're making like a sign up or a login request, the first time when you're authenticating a user, you would want to store some metadata about the user in the database. So for that use case, you can actually make a direct database call to insert into the DB or make a GraphQL query as an admin to make an insert in the user table with the fields that are specifically required instead of creating the entire schema with all the account and session information in the DB. Cool. Let's go to example. I think the npm install is done. So let's do npm run dev. And we have like a env setup that needs to be configured. Let me zoom out a little bit. Yeah. So open 3000. Let me check if this is running. Yes. This is loading. Right, so I'm not signed in yet, and you have this default UI coming in from NextAuth example. We have a client-side rendering version of the app. We have a server-side rendering version of the app, and protecting some API routes examples, right? So we'll see how to implement each of them. Right. Now to set up some configuration, we'll need to copy this env file and then create another version. So let me just copy this env.example. Let me do ls This would be env.local.example to env.local. Now let's go ahead and remove the unnecessary variables. So we're not going to use sign in with Apple, Auth0, Facebook, and so on. So let's remove these. Let's maybe keep GitHub and Google for now. And database URL as well, since we're not going to actually store the session information in the DB. So I'm going to remove this as well as of now. And for secret, you can use this command or just go to this URL to generate a secret. Let's go to this. I'm going to copy paste this and then substitute the value over here. And the NextAuth URL is just the base URL that we need to configure. So this is localhost 3000 running on my local machine. Right, so this is fine. We'll come back to GitHub configuration in a while. Cool. Now the next step is to look at the auth directory, the API directory in pages. This will be the API routes. These can be deployed on serverless as serverless functions on Vercel. And this notation basically means that any request to auth / something would be routed to this component. And this will handling of any API routes. For example, there is a sign in, there's a callback, there's a sign out, and so on. So all of these API routes will be directed to this. And we'll have some configuration over here to say what to do on each of those. Right, so the default configuration looks like this. We have a providers config, which will tell what are the enable providers. So if I go back to my localhost instance, if I click on sign in, right, so since we have not configured anything, we don't have. And so for this, we'll remove email. We don't need Apple or Zero and all of these. So we'll stick to just GitHub, Google, and we'll remove the rest. And the database is optional, so this is fine. We'll comment this out as well. The secret will come from the env secret. So if we go to env.local, this is a secret that will be parsed and that will be used. Right. Sorry about that. So I have a session configuration. So here, since we're using JWT, we are enabling this session. Then inside the config for JWT, we have a bunch of things to do to enable. We need the secret to be configured, which will come in from the secret that we declared. So this would be secret followed by process.env.secret. And we probably don't need encryption for now, so let's skip that. And we need a way to encode and decode the token that we create with JWT. So these are the two functions that we need to override to override the default behavior that NextAuth provides. Cool. So stepping back to see what Hasura requires for JWT, we'll go to authentication using JWT. We have webhooks, we have JWT. We look at using JWT. So in this, we need to have some custom claims that needs to be configured when we're creating the token. So for example, if I go to jwt.io, if you look at the encoded token, this is the base64 encoded token. And here, if you look at the payload, this is the JSON that's being generated for the token. So this ideally would contain the user ID, the name, and the issue time, the expiry time, and so on. Shouldn't really contain sensitive information because this could be accessible by the front-end client, right? So we'll generate this payload with the format that Hasura specifies, including the custom claims that Hasura wants, right? So if we include this object in the payload, Hasura will be able to parse these variables inside that custom claim. And then it will be able to apply the values given here in the permission system that we configure with Hasura. So that's how we're going to use JWT. So to create a token, we need to use the signing method with the secret. For that, we'll import the JSON Web Token module. And let's do that by installing that module. We have JSON Web Token. And if we go up here, we'll do import JWT from JSON Web Token. Right, so we have, I hope we have the module ready, yeah. So the next step is to create a payload, basically the token claims. So I'll just say JWT claims, and we need to create an object of these keys. So let me just copy paste this claim, the sample claim that Hasura gives. Do some indentation. And we need to substitute some values over here. And so the values in the claims are the default ones. Like we will have the sub, the name, admin is probably not required. You will have the issued at time to specify when the token was issued. You will also have like an expiry time to say when will this token expire. So this is to be done. And you have the JWT claims that Hasura will parse. This has a bunch of key value pairs. This has the allowed roles, the default role, user ID, and any other custom variation of env variables, right? So, sorry, the session variables, right? This, for example, uses org ID. Typically, we don't need these for this example, but you can go ahead with as many number of custom variables that you want in as part of your application. So now in this example, I'm just going to make use of role user. So I'm going to remove the other roles. We'll stick to allowed roles being user, the default role being user. In fact, the accessor role will be user, and the user ID will have to come in from somewhere. So we'll see how that comes in. Cool. And we'll need to substitute values for this. This will also come in from dynamically from somewhere. And the issued at time would be date.now divided by 1000, represent in seconds. And the expiry time. So let's say same date.now divided by 1000, and we'll add like a 1 day time interval. So this could be this should ideally be a very short time interval. So I'm just adding like a 1 day time interval right now. This should be actually in minutes, and then you use something like a refresh token to uh, keep rotating the token, and then have like a short expiry, like a 15-minute expiry time. Then keep making requests in the background from your client to rotate the token, right? So this is done. This is just a naive example to have a higher expiry time, and the user ID value will come in from somewhere, right? So maybe we'll also add email, right? So these will come in from the token that we generate. So this would be token dot ID. I'm going to assign the ID to the sub, and this will be token dot name. This would be token dot email. Token is an argument that comes over here, so we'll see how that comes in. And over here, this would be token dot ID again for the user ID. Right. So this is where we are at right now. We have the encode function. We have the JWT claims created. Now we need to form the encoded token. This would use the JWT module that we imported above from the JSON Web Token module. We'll do JWT.sign to sign this token. This would be JWT claims followed by the secret. The secret is also coming in as an argument over here, so we'll use that. This is basically the secret that we configured in our env. So if we go back to env.local, this was the secret that we created by using the random generator online. So this would be secret, and we need to specify the algorithm. This would be HS256. So there are multiple algorithms that you can choose. HS256 would use the HMAC SHA verification. So there will be only one key, secret key that needs to be generated, which will be shared between the server and Hasura. And that is applicable for both verifying the token and signing the token. If you're using like an RS256, RS512 kind of algorithm, you will generate like a public private key pair. The private key will be used by the server, and the public key will be used for verifying the token. Right. So in that case, the private key will be used by this particular Next server who's signing the token. And the verifying token business will happen both over here as well as on the Hasura side when you're configured the JWT secret on Hasura. So we'll use the public key over there on Hasura. In this case, since we're using HS256, we'll configure the secret on Hasura's end as well. So the verification will happen with the same secret. And the signing of the token will happen the same side, right? So this is the encoded token, and we'll return this encoded token. Right. And next up, we'll need to write some logic to decode the token. And let's say decoded token, this would be JWT.verify. Verify the token with the secret. And here the algorithms would be same. We'll use HS256. And we'll also return the decoded token. Okay, so we've written logic to encode the token and also decode the token inside the JWT config. Right. So just looking at the chat. Right. Rahul says, I all are waiting for something like this. Sure. Yes. For Next.js, there aren't too many auth examples. So that's the reason why we're doing this today. And Akshay says he's trying to use Git queue with Kubernetes, right? I think that can be taken offline on Discord. Today we're going to talk about Next.js and NextAuth specifically. Cool. So we're done with the first set of things that needs to be done for the encoding and decoding. This is fine. And next up, let me configure the GitHub ID and secret on a different file so that this is not visible to the end audience. Let me actually open up Lime and I'll come back to this once I wrap up configuring that. Also in the comments, if you have any specific queries around Next.js authentication, feel free to post in. Or if there is any query around Hasura's JWT or which ones to use, like if you want to use webhook or JWT integration, feel free to post those questions on chat. Be happy to take them on the stream. Right. I think I have configured my secrets. Let me close this one. Great. Let me actually run this app now. And go to NextAuth docs. So what we've done is we've configured session and JWT. The next thing we have is callbacks. So if you look at the docs for callbacks, they say that you have to use this if you have to set some custom values like the user ID as part of the token so that you can process that in the JWT token. So whenever there is a sign-in action that happens on the client, the user signs in on GitHub or Google, there's a callback URL that is configured, and then they'll come back to this. Once the callback URL is called, there are a couple of callback methods that will be executed. First one would be the JWT method, and followed by the session method, which will be passing data to the browser. So the JWT method is where we'll override some more, or probably we'll add in more data based on the data that comes in from the auth provider. And the session will actually just return back additional data, including the ID of the user and the token of the user, right? So these are the two things that we'll need to do inside these callbacks, right? So Let me uncomment these. We'll need session, we'll need JWT. First up, we'll look at JWT method. We'll need to modify this. And then session would be around adding in some more fields. Right, so if the app is running, let's localhost 3000. And we have this. We click on sign in. So this is the default template that NextAuth gives you, depending on the providers that you have enabled. Since we have enabled GitHub and Google, these are the two buttons that come up. If you have like username, password, credentials, you will have like a sign up box that you can map it with. And so this is the configuration. Depending on the configuration over here, you will see the UI getting auto-generated. So this is code written for this in this example. You can obviously map it with your own custom UI. They have a few APIs to trigger these. So I think this should be available in, if I go to GitHub, yeah, probably not here. I think probably in providers. This looks like the same. So they have a few methods like sign in method, and let me look at callbacks. This is not that. Yeah, you have a few methods. This is actually events, in fact, but you have a few APIs like sign in, sign out that you can call in from your client inside a client. I think this is use down this use get token. Where are these docs? This is get session, client side. This is get session. Cool. So yeah, there are some APIs which you can call on the client side and the server side. This is get session and get token. But you also have like the sign in and other methods that you can trigger, which will actually make a call to your what provider or all of these sign in services. Right. So that's fine. Here's another question from Matt. What's the best way to store JWT on the client side? Typically what people do is they store it in local storage. But the problem with that is you're vulnerable to like an XSS attack. And then they move on to HTTP only cookie where you store the token and then pass it on in the cookie. Different use cases and different. So if you don't have any critical information in the payload, it doesn't matter actually, because you have to anyway handle XSS attacks on your client, and you will anyway handle that as part of your overall application security. But the ideal way would be to use like a HTTP only cookie and then pass on the token. Right. So that's for that. And let me check the other comments. Yeah, I'm switching between like Twitch and YouTube. So give me like a second. Right. So let's come back to the callbacks. We'll have to define the session method and the JWT method, expand on these. We'll need to approach this by adding some values to the session. So here, this would be again finding out the encoded token. So this would be sign of this would, in fact, we can call this token to represent the token. So the token, and we'll sign it using the secret. Again, we'll follow the algorithm, which is HS256. And um, we'll need a couple of values to be assigned. We'll need the ID of the session to be assigned, and then we'll need the token itself. This would be session.id, where we'll assign token.id, and session dot token. This would be the encoded token that we created just above. And then finally, we'll return the session. We'll return a promise, in fact. Start resolve of session. So the first thing that will be called is actually JWT method when you're making a sign-in request. Here we need to check if user is signed in. Signed in. So we can check by just verifying if the user object exists. So they are signed in. And if we can just change this to is user signed in. So convention. If a user is signed in, we can use the value of the user.id right before returning the token. And again, over here, this would be promise, returning promise. This would be called first, the JWT. This would add the user ID to the token payload. Once this is done, the session method will be called. And here, over here, we are encoding the token and then returning the session with additional value like the token. This will be the encoded token as well. We're doing this because on the client, we will need the actual access token to be available to make an authenticated query. So this session.token, this line actually adds the token that you can access from your client or on the server-side rendering as well, which will allow you to use this in your headers, make an authorization barrier token. So this will be that token, and you can make an authenticated request on top of this. Right. So this is session.token, returning a promise. This is async JWT, this is returning a promise. We've handled callbacks as well for both of these. We don't want any events to be debugged right now. We can also have debug. Maybe we can add a debug true to enable debug messaging on the logs to see if there are any additional information coming in. Cool. So let me actually now refresh this. And we have sign in. I'm going to click on sign with GitHub. I've already logged in with GitHub on my browser. So this is actually working. So I've got the, so if you've not logged in before, you would have gotten a prompt for authorizing from GitHub to access your account email because of the configuration that we've done for the data for the GitHub provider. Once you've done that, the callback will happen, the token will be processed. So in fact, this is the token that has been generated. If you look at the network tab, the session, there's an API call being made to localhost 3000/API/auth/session. There's a GET request, and we have a bunch of information coming back from the server. This is the expiry of the token. There's a token itself and some metadata about the user. What we care about is this piece of information. This is the token, right? So I'm going to copy this and then debug this on jwt.io. Right, so I've copy pasted this encoded token, and the decoded payload has some information about the user. So this is myself using my GitHub account. The issued at time, if you look at it, is February 3, and there's an expiry time for February 4, which is like 1 day ahead because of the 24-hour time that we allocated for the expiry time. And there's a JWT claims object, which is having some session variables. There are 4 session variables over here. One is for the allowed roles. So if the user has multiple roles, can have multiple roles, then the list of allowed roles will come in over here. In this case, we're just sticking to one role. And if there are multiple roles over here, we can specify which role this current query belongs to. And then you can pass in that kind of that role value over here. This is the Hasura user ID. This is probably coming in from GitHub. This is the GitHub's unique ID. We can either use this as the unique user ID on the database, or we can use something else and then store this as just another column in the database, right, for the user ID. Cool. So we've generated this. I think we are probably, I'm just checking it in the payload. There's this ID. Yeah, there's expiry and so on. Cool. And there is token. All right. So let's go to Hasura console and then configure the JWT secret to this project. I have this Next.js Hasura project that I used in the last stream. I'm going to add a JWT secret, which should be of type HS256. And the key will come in secret that we used previously. I'm going to open my project that contains my GitHub secret. So I'm just using it on my different screen. Right, so we generated this token using that online generator for a 32-character string. I'm just copy pasting it over here. This is the secret that we've used. I'm going to add this. Right, so now this has been applied. Let's open the console for this. And let's set up some default values for user. We have like a user table. we can put in some values based on this user ID and then see how the querying can happen using some other value. Right. We have like a user table. This is from last time around. We have a user's auth table. Let me create a new value. This is of ID. And let me use my name. Right. So the schema won't work because we don't have any authorization header configured. The collaborator token has been removed. So we're not an admin. We're not making a request as an admin yet. Let me go to data and user auth. We have a user role. And the permission says that the ID column has to equal to the session variable call Hasura user ID. So only if that matches, we'll be able to fetch data from this table for the role user. If you remember, our token had a role user, and the user ID is this. So we need data in this user ID format to be able to fetch this table. Make a query with the authorization token. Have the bearer token. Encountered number. Got it. So I think if I inspect it, the sub value has to be a string. So we shouldn't be using a number. So this can be toString maybe. Now let's sign out and then regenerate the token. Going to clear cache from this. Right. Now let me click on sign in again, GitHub. And looking at the session. Let me copy paste these into my API Explorer. Add a token. This time around says passing text fix with a string, but encounter number. Let me look at what value has changed. I'm guessing the user ID has to be a string as well. So let's change that as well. Over here, this would be this. Right, so let me do the same thing again. Clear site data. And then sign in with GitHub. Hopefully this time around the token was generated with strings. Let's see. Let me add bearer. And yes. So let me inspect this token. So console has this feature, which I think a lot of people have not seen before or used before. You can inspect the token that you've inserted and then basically decode the payload, very similar to what you see over here. Oh, sorry. Yeah, very similar to the JWT debugger interface. But this time here you can see the Hasura claims very specifically parsed out. We can see the user role and the user ID value. And we have the full payload over here and the type of the algorithm used. Cool. So we can see that the values are here, the token is here, and we're able to see based on introspection that user query is accessible. So let's make a user's auth query for the ID and name columns. And I can actually fetch my own user data. Uh, Let me remove the authorization token and add the collaborative token, which allows me to fetch anybody's data. So this would give me all the data in the database, so without any condition. So this is like an admin. I can use this or the Hasura admin secret to make an admin request. So the token generation is working as expected. Uh, we have generated a JWT token from a Next.js API route. Now what is missing here is once you've signed in with GitHub, what you've not done is we've not stored this user ID automatically into the database. So instead of me going to insert row and obviously changing this, we need some automation to sync this data back into the DB. That is where we'll make use of these async methods. So once you've done a sign in or a sign up, you can make like an upsert request into the DB, which will update some values. So over here, what we can do is we can make a HTTP call, which would, this can actually call our GraphQL API to our GraphQL API. And this would be like basically the mutation that will be insert user or maybe insert user one. So I'll actually try this out on GraphQL. Instead of this authorization, I'll open the collaborative token, have the mutation, insert users one, have an object, and I should ideally be able to give these two values. So instead of ID being this, I'll give the GitHub ID, which would, let's say, something like this. And in fact, this is users. Yeah, and I will get back the ID, right? And then the name of the user from the database, and probably more columns as well. Like you might want to store the email and maybe the GitHub profile picture and some more metadata around that user. This mutation call needs to happen server side. Can happen asynchronously, but I think this call has to be resolved before you make authenticated request to the GraphQL API further. This particular mutation can be made by an admin, right? Or this in fact can be, since we're making it from the server side, this can be made by an admin. So we can technically use like an admin secret. So if you remember Auth0 integration, or if you've done Auth0 integration before with Hasura, you would set up something called a rule where you will trigger that rule whenever a sign-in happens. In fact, Auth0 triggers that rule whenever a sign-in event happens or a sign-up event happens. And inside that rule, you would actually make a API call to the database through Hasura's GraphQL endpoint, making this mutation. And the data syncing will happen through that rule, right? So we have a couple of rules in Auth0. We have one rule for JWT claims and one rule for making the sync between your Auth0 data and the database in Postgres. So very similarly here, we'll make a Postgres call. So store this in Postgres. So we'll make like this can be a simple fetch call. You don't need a fancy client to do this. Typically, you can do like a fetch the GraphQL endpoint, which is in this case my Hasura Cloud endpoint, followed by the options object, which would say method post, and followed by the GraphQL query, right? So this would be the GraphQL query. This is a mutation, and you don't need variables also. I think you can just substitute values over here. And then once you do this fetch, this will be in an await as well. And once you have the response coming in from uh, this mutation, you're assured that the data is in the DB, the ID of the user is in the DB. Then you can resolve it and then send it back to the client saying that, okay, this is the token for the user. And once it is in the browser, the token, basically the way we saw it over here, once it's available over here on the browser console or anywhere on the client to be accessible, you can start making HTTP calls to your GraphQL server with this token. So in fact, in this, let's assume that this is the call that you make inside a client. You would just pass in this additional headers, which would be authorization, followed by bearer, followed by the token that we generated, right? Uh, so this is fundamentally what you need to do to make authenticated requests from the client. Now, how does it differ for, let's say, an Apollo client? What do you need to do in addition to what we did here? So this is all set up on the server side. Now, if you go back to our underscore app.js, this is like the HOC configuration for passing in some props. Typically, if you remember our previous stream, we did the configuration for Apollo provider over here. We actually imported Apollo provider. So this would be Apollo provider from Apollo/client. And what we did was, instead of this provider over here, we would wrap our Apollo provider passing in client. So this would be client. And we created the client in the step above. And we passed in the component. Now what we're doing here is there is a provider here from the NextAuth client. We can, so we're just wrapping this provider on top of all of this. So we have an Apollo provider which has access to the client, which sends in the client to all the components that can use client.query, client.mutate, and also all the use effect hooks. And we have provider over here, which passes in the session information to the props. So this is the session prop that's being sent. Now this, you might be wondering, how does session come in over here? Who sends this information? So if you go back to server.js on the server-side rendering, we are actually sending this prop called session. So this is from their example app. On the get server-side props, we are sending a session prop by using this get session method. We have a use session and get session hook. So with the get session method passing in the context, we pass in the session prop. Once we do this, it will be accessible inside the page props. So the page props will have whatever we send here. So the page prop will have session. This could be any variable over here. Here we're sending in session. So this will be available as page props.session over here. And the session will, in fact, contain the token for your queries. So the token will be the access token that you want to pass in to your authorization header. So that's the difference with Apollo client. With a normal fetch API call or SWR kind of a functionality, you will just import that fetch library or the hook for SWR, and then call that. Um, and then you will probably pass in some fetcher logic. The fetcher logic will have the token access on whatever pages the fetcher logic is written. So that's the difference between making authenticated calls with normal fetch API and with an Apollo client kind of a setup. Once you're passing in the provider, so the client creation happens somewhere over here, if you remember correctly. So this would be client um, creating the Apollo client method. This create Apollo client will come in from a library that we generated for Apollo, right? And then this will have access to the token as well, since page props dot session dot token is accessible over here. We'll pass in this token to the Apollo client creation step, and we'll make use of that token inside our headers. I'll just drop in the link for the previous stream that we did. Obviously, we don't have Apollo client installed on this module, so let me check the link for my previous stream on Next.js, which had the Apollo client configuration. I'll drop the link. Yeah, I'm just dropping in Next.js plus Apollo. Right, so just looking at some comments. NextAuth uses ins for their ID, it's a pain. Yeah, I figured this out today. Had to do a toString on the sub and user ID values. Um, please share the next.js file and the example files. I'll upload this on GitHub, and then there's another part to this stream, which is to actually use like a real-time subscription on top of this. So we've done authentication today with JWT. We've done Apollo client setup the last time around. We've roughly seen what that integration would look like together. In another stream, what we'll do is we'll actually integrate them and then make a real-time subscription call using WebSockets, and then see how easy it is to actually write some modular components and then reuse them. So this could be either using Apollo client, or we can in fact use SWR as well, as one user has pointed out. Possible to have some examples in the repo that include passing in a header for SWR or a fetch call that include the token from the session variable. Yes. So what I'll do is I'll create like a couple of branches, one for just a plain vanilla version of this, and one for including a fetch API version of this, or like an SWR version. So I've written an SWR library. I think I've shared it last time around as well. But that doesn't have the authentication integration. It just has a plain setup. In fact, I'll just put that link over here as well. It should be fairly simple to add a header value to this. So I have this fetch wrapper. Um, Headers are currently hard-coded over here, but this could come in as an argument to this fetch function, right? And then this headers could come in dynamically, can be built dynamically based on the token that you receive. But fundamentally, this is just two libraries. We have like a fetch, one fetch function for queries and mutations, and one subscribe function for the real-time GraphQL queries on subscriptions on WebSockets. And the endpoint just changes. That's the only difference over here for this. I'll again drop link for this library. This would be SWR plus GraphQL. Cool. I think that's it for today's stream. I'll push this on GitHub, and then I'll add a comment on the channel on the description. And I have two branches, one for the vanilla version and for the authenticated version. And in the next stream, we'll actually look at integrating Apollo provider and then the token and make an authorized request. We've actually verified the authorization on Hasura's end. The token generation is working. So we just need to now add this Apollo provider integration in a full flow and then make an authorized request. Cool. That's it for today. Thanks for joining in. I'll post the links on the chat and then on the YouTube channel as well. And then feel free to join in the next one for the Apollo client or the SWI integration as well. Thanks, folks. Thanks for joining in. See you until next time. Bye-bye.